One of the striking features in the post-war era is that even though incomes have not converged over time, certainly health outcomes as measured by life expectancy, you see that these are the OECD countries. They began around 67 years, gone up to almost 80 years. But you see that countries like China and India, even sub-Saharan Africa, they have caught up. They've not quite reached, but at least this gap here is much bigger than this gap here. So that we can say that even though incomes have diverged, health outcomes like life expectancy, they have converged. So I think, and of course the reasons are that, because antibiotics, medical technologies have spread, those have allowed communicable diseases to come down. Those have allowed even poorest countries to make advances that have allowed then this gap to narrow over time. For those of you who are interested, there's a bit of a, you see this in sub-Saharan Africa, stagnating, coming down and then picking up, because generally this should increase steadily, and this is really the AIDS crisis in Africa. What happened was, because of AIDS, life expectancy in some countries came down by 10, 15, 20 years over a very short period of time. Again, now is where, can everyone see this little blip here? Even people at the top left-hand corner, the people I've neglected? Yeah? Okay, so that's the okay. So income divergence, but on other outcomes like health, there has been convergence. Okay, now we have to move on to Indian economic history. I have, as I said, 1 hour, but maybe I will not be able to do it, to capture 75 years of Indian economic, or 70 years of Indian economic history. Because I think that, as I said earlier, even if you're doing a course on contemporary themes in economics, I think you have to have 1 or 2 lectures on what happened in India since independence. Now, one way of doing it would be, say, in 51 this happened, in 55 this happened, 58 this happened. I think apart from the fact that it's probably very boring for students, also it's going to be very difficult to convey that material. So here's kind of an alternative way of thinking about it. It's not the best way of doing it, but it's an alternative to a sequencing way of doing it. Now here, I think the thought that one of the thoughts I want you to keep in mind here is that there is something very special about the Indian development model. I call this the precocious model of development. Precocious means, sorry? Okay. Precocious means that, when a child is precocious, it's doing some things well ahead of its time. Yeah? So I'm going to argue in this session and come back to it at the end, the last session, on this precocious development model. So if you really want to understand the precocious development model, you're doomed to being here for all 14 modules. Okay, what I mean by that, the first thing is, of course, this is a chart that shows percentage years democracy since independence. So 0 means always a non-democratic, 1 means always democratic. And what was the level of income at independence? Now, notice that all these countries, and India is here, and it shows firstly that India is one of 5 countries that have always been democratic since independence. And I think it's a useful fact for all of you to remember. We think that India is the only country. Actually, it's not. There are, I think, 4 other countries that have been. In fact, if you look at the chart closely enough, you will find that these are all at 1, and India is at a little bit less than 1. Why? Emergency, exactly. For 2 years, India was not, or whatever, 20 months, India was not democratic, so it doesn't quite get 1. It's maybe 98 or 99%. So that's fact number 1. Fact number 2 is that it's something that comes out that these other countries, so fact number 1, one of the few countries always been democratic. That's very unique in history. Remember, all these countries are here. But what is really special about India is that this was achieved despite starting at very, very low levels of income. Other countries started it at higher levels of income, but India. So in political science, this is a big puzzle. How did India manage to sustain, oh, I have a stick here in case.
A relic from the past.
A relic from the past. That, should I use it on you or the thing? It's a different question. But sometimes I may have to use it. Okay, so let me come this side. Let me favor the left because it's easy for me. So is this transition working? Yeah, oh, this is good, okay. So, for example, so as I was saying, India, one of few countries that were always democratic, but what is really special is that it sustained it at low levels of income. Even these countries, they started off much richer, and so that's a political science mystery, because usually you think that you have to have higher levels of literacy, a less agrarian population, all of these. And so this is in some ways the great Indian achievement, being a democracy despite being at very low levels of income. A little bit of a quiz here for you, and this is to make it more interactive. I will allow 3 guesses on which country is represented by CRI.
Croatia.
Wrong. Croatia, wrong.
Costa Rica.
Brilliant. Oh, this is Costa Rica, exactly. So this is Costa Rica. So in this, 1 Asian country, 1 African country, 2 Caribbean countries, and 1 Central American country. There's one fact about Costa Rica that all of you should know, which makes it a really interesting country, even more interesting than India in this one respect, and certainly much more interesting than Pakistan. In Pakistan we say, India managed to keep the generals, out of politics. Pakistan couldn't. But guess what Costa Rica did? At independence, they said, no army, no generals. So that's what's very interesting about Costa Rica. It's kind of interesting factoid. Okay, so it's a precocious democracy, and not clicking. Oh, I've got the wrong one.
From there on
It will work only from here? Yes. I'm not biased, the marker is biased. Yeah, okay, so we'll try and work it out. The other thing that is very special about India is that it has managed to maintain, so this is a chart, this is again GDP per capita at independence on the x-axis. Does this work? Yeah. On the screen, does it work? Yeah. And this is a measure of ethnic fractionalization. That is, how divided is a society? In fact, the way you measure this is to ask the question that if you were to take any 2 people from a country at random, what is the probability that they will not be of the same, either caste or religion or whatever, right? And so, there's a way of measuring this. And it turns out that India is one of the most fractionalized countries, because it turns out that, Indian historians have remarked on the fact that, I think in all societies have divisions, religion, language, culture, gender, region. But I think India is unique in at least one dimension, is this caste dimension. Of course, very few other countries have caste. So if you aggregate it all together, you find that India is very cleavaged. And of course, political scientists will tell you that actually makes sustaining a democracy more difficult, because there are many, many more differences in society. And so you have to keep this in mind. I'm going to come back to it in the last chart, that this is something very special about India, to have a democracy at low levels of income for very long, and that it did that under conditions of being very, very fractionalized in society. So now we go to the next. So this is how I teach Indian economic history, i.e. the early part. I say, look, all societies need to make 3 big choices. Okay, choice number 1, political. I put that choice within inverted comma, not because someone actually sits down and says we'll do this or not, but de facto that's what happens. Societies make choices. The political choice, democracy or autocracy. That's one choice. Then there's an economic choice, markets or state, and to what extent, and we'll get into that in a second. And then, of course, social choices, especially if you begin so fractionalized. How do you make sure that over time these divisions come down and are not exacerbated or aggravated? And then, broadly you can say there are two ways of doing it. Broadly, I mean, I'm sure you can think of more ways of doing it. Do you actually make growth inclusive or reduce this by providing opportunities to all, or by doing guarantees, i.e., so-and-so is guaranteed, so many seats in parliament, jobs, this community has jobs. So that's what I call guarantees, opportunities. So in some ways, one can think about what India did in 1947 and subsequently in terms of these three choices. And I find this a kind of manageable, analytically tractable way of managing, what kinds of things, and then we can fit in all the things that were done under these three categories. So, now, interesting, I mean, I'm not a historian, but, even to understand economics, you have to understand a little bit of history. It's clear that individuals made a big impact on early Indian development choices, whether they were economic, political, or social. And here it's a beautiful picture that my team has come. I mean, it's such a gorgeous picture. The two leaning in and listening into the father of the nation. It's just I mean, makes my hair stand on end. You can see that there were at least, I mean, obviously there are others like Dr. Ambedkar also who had a big choice, but I think in terms of economics, certainly there were these three big things, and there were competing visions. Nehru wanted self-reliance, industrialization, and he believed in the government, in the state. The state will lead industrialization. Gandhiji, of course, had a completely different vision, self-reliance, agriculture, village communities, no industrialization. And of course, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel was, much more pro-agricultural landlords, pro-business, kind of represented what today you might say is kind of the right side of the ideological spectrum, more markets, more agriculture, but not just that distinction, but, different kinds of, and you will find when we go through this, each of them, of course, Nehru had the most, I think, dominant impact, but I think the others too had an important impact in some very important ways. So in addition to individuals, ideas determined what choices we made. And this is very, very important to understand, because today, especially all of you youngsters here, you think, oh, why did we do socialism? Oh, bad. Why did we do this? Bad. We forget that these were choices made at a point of time in history. So you have to roll back the tape of time to understand why these choices were made. Now, 1 minute, Zubair, just 1 minute. So if you go back to 1947, at that point in time, 30s have happened, 40s have happened, what happened in the 30s and 40s? One, we had, for example, the Great Depression in the United States, and after that, to respond to that, the Americans built a welfare state, created a huge state. Similarly, after 1945, Europe also, there's a famous in the United Kingdom, the National Health Service was built, health provided by the state free for everyone. So it was a mood where everyone believed that capitalism was not working. It created the Great Depression. It didn't look after the poor. So we needed to actually draw upon the state much more. That's one. Second, we forget today, we think about Putin's Russia or Gorbachev's Russia. In fact, at that point, the successful societies were Japan and Russia. And Russia at that point was very successful. And in fact, Russia was a completely socialist model of development. So can we play so your small video clip, And we'll do a little bit of a quiz here as well.
Speech railing against the West and is quoted in the media as saying, "I will bury you."
It became such legend, which of course was also very different, and he never told that he will bury Americans.
In reality, what he did say can be more closely translated as a promise that communism will outlast capitalism. Yet,
So, who is this first of all? Nikita Khrushchev, exactly. Nikita Khrushchev, who was, before, after Stalin and before Brezhnev. He was the leader. And essentially what he came to the United Nations, this I think 1952 or 54. He came and he's supposed to have taken off his shoe and banged on the podium there and said, "We will bury you." Of course, some people thought it was referred to the nuclear bomb that he was going to unleash. It's not the case. He actually meant communism will outdo capitalism. And it doesn't, today it looks ridiculous. But at that point in time, it didn't, because the Soviet Union was growing fairly rapidly. It had built up a lot of industry. It was an example of pretty successful industrialization at that point in time. So that's the background, the ideological background when India made some of these choices. So then that was the kind of ideology from abroad. There was an ideology at home, economic ideology. In fact, just before independence, a bunch of Indian industrialists, private sector people in Bombay, called the Bombay, it's called what the document that they gave the government was called the Bombay Plan. And they said in that plan, they didn't say, capitalism, less government. They said the opposite. They said, we want the government to lead industrialization. We want there to be, barriers against goods coming in because we want to promote the domestic manufacturing sector. And that is why. So it's a combination of Nehru as an individual plus all these influences that actually determined what India finally ended up doing. Sorry. So next we go to the first choice, and I want to talk about democracy versus autocracy, not in political terms, but in economic terms. It is actually really, really important to understand this from an economic point of view. If you go back to the 30s and 40s and 50s, when you look at economic thinking, development thinking, people said the poor countries are poor because they don't have enough savings. You need more savings, and that's what finances investment. So, and if you look at all the growth models, Harrod, Domar, etc., in all this, the constraint was savings. You increase savings, you increase investment, economies grow, right? But then the question was, well, how do you get these savings? When you're very poor, how do you get savings? Right? People are poor, they save less, they consume more. How do you get savings? And it turns out that there was an example of China and Russia who actually got these savings even at low levels of income by doing what? That saving from agriculture was used to finance industrialization. Mao Zedong tried the same thing. The Great Leap Forward was about, it led to about 30-40 million people dying of starvation. In 57, 58, some people think more, some people think less, but I'm not a historian, and I don't want to get into China bashing here. But the thing is that they also extracted savings from agriculture essentially by being ruthless. And that was the sense in which autocracies, they thought, was better for long run growth because you could get the savings from agriculture to finance investment. India, on the other hand, no, we couldn't do that because our agricultural policies were constrained by the fact that we were a democracy and we were a decentralized democracy. Agriculture issues were state subjects, exactly. So it's nobody from Delhi could say we're going to extract this. And of course, here's where the influence of Dr. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel came in. He also said you cannot tax agricultural income. In fact, in our constitution, the center cannot tax agricultural income, and that was a Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel legacy. So you can't expropriate from agriculture, you can't even tax agriculture. center is constrained, it's a state subject. So where do you get the savings? And that was the cruel choice. That is, you could either have, this was the sense in which you could either have freedom or you could have growth. That's the cruel choice that actually India was facing, or supposed to have faced, by choosing democracy. And also, by the way, the other thing about agricultural policies was we couldn't even do forcible land reform, because that again would be very undemocratic. So what we had was voluntary land reform under Vinoba Bhave, and of course it was all voluntary, so nothing much happened. And so India was therefore doomed to low savings because of not being able to tax agriculture. So this is very important to understand, because then it leads to the next big choice that India made in terms of, just one point, that we forget today we're a strong, powerful country, we don't borrow from anywhere, we don't get foreign aid, but at that point in time, because we didn't have savings, we got a lot of foreign aid, especially from the United States. And a lot of it was in the form of food aid, PL 480 food aid. And at that point in time, this is a very important historical fact, that we were the darling of Western donors then. In fact, 25% of the plan was financed by foreign aid in the 1960s. I'm doing something wrong? You're making it softer. Okay, so we didn't have our own savings, so we got it from abroad, and we were the darling of the Western donors because they wanted democracy to succeed. They did not want China and Russia to succeed. They said, this is a model based on democratic values. We want it to succeed, and we used to get, at least until the 60s, early 60s, we got a lot of aid, and then of course things changed very dramatically in 66 when we had a major 2 consecutive famines. The geopolitics got much more complicated. So there we go then to, what did India do? What were the big things that India did, big choices that made between markets and the state? So the first thing we did was, in the 1956 Industrial Policy Resolution, India decided to take control of the state of the commanding heights, but yet have a mixed economy. So this is again, the government will do all the important sectors, the steel, coal, whatever called heavy industries, government would do it. But because we still had democracy, we still had a private sector, unlike Russia, we said the state won't do everything, it will do many of the important things which involved a lot of investment, steel, iron, coal, but other sectors we will leave to the private sector, and in some cases private sector and public sector could both be part of it. So that is the first choice we made in terms of who will do what in the economy. The second thing was industrialization, and here is where I want to link this back to what I said about savings. So when Pandit Nehru then, he called upon this statistician who created ISI Calcutta, Dr. Mahalanobis, and said, you do a development strategy for India. It's called the Mahalanobis, and that was incorporated in the second plan. And lots of things about this are very interesting, but one of the big choices that were made in this plan was, remember, you don't have enough savings, so you won't get future growth. So the big decision was, how much should resources go into investment and how much should resources go into consumption? And there was, in this model, which was an elaborate model, there was in fact one critical parameter, a choice. How much resources should we put in investment in heavy goods or investment goods and investment in consumer goods? So if you put a lot in consumer goods, it will be consumed, there won't be savings, there won't be industrialization. But then if you don't put enough in this, people can't eat today. So it became a choice between consumption today and consumption tomorrow. That was the cruel choice that led to this. So apparently there was a lot of agony, and the model depended upon how much should the state invest in one set of industries as opposed to another. And remember, this therefore is a way of how they straddle this. You can't extract resources from agriculture. So what you do is that when the state invests money, it puts less into agriculture and more into industry, and as a way of increasing savings and investment. And that was kind of the conceptual background to the plan. It was related to the political choices we made. So it was not kind of inconsistent, very coherent, cogent kind of thinking. Now, okay, so we had industrialization. That was a choice, lambda k equals 1 by 3. But the other choice was how much do we allow foreign competition and how much do we, promote our domestic sector. That's called import substituting industrialization, because you want domestic production to substitute for imports because you want to develop the local economy. Now, that too had some origins. It didn't just come out of nowhere. It came out of course, colonialism. A country that newly emerges from colonialism has seen kind of the worst impact of foreign rule, including foreign capital. These guys came, they extracted us, and there's, of course, there was a big debate and a very, very compelling work actually by Dadabhai Naoroji, who said that basically the Indian industry suffered, especially the textile sector suffered because of being these people took our cotton and took it away and didn't allow our sector to develop. So that was one background to this. The second very, very respectable intellectual background to this was people said that, Raul Prebisch and Hans Singer said, if you do agriculture, for example, agriculture prices come down over time. It's not a good thing to do. Therefore, you have to do industry because there you get better prices. And the way to do it is by doing, import substituting industrialization. Therefore, very early on, we basically had lots of restrictions on foreign trade, foreign exchange, foreign direct investment. So we were what is called a very closed economy, closed to foreign competition of all sorts. And so we did more savings, we did more industrialization, did it more in the public sector, we did it through domestic rather than competition. So these were some of the big choices we made. And then we did something really, really, I think I would call this one of the most distinctive things we did, which is what is called industrial licensing. Now, after this, I'm going to show a slide where I'm going to make a lot of demands on your patience and your attention. So you have to listen to this very carefully. So essentially what industrial licensing was domestic industrialists needed to get permission before they could expand or even enter a market. Now think about how weird this is. It's not at all, remember that going back to this import substitution, i.e. limits on foreign trade, this was today, it seems a little bit crazy because everyone is globalizing, but actually it was very respectable then because most countries in the world did it at that. Most developing countries at that point, especially in Latin America, Turkey, even to some extent in East Asia, they did the same thing. They restricted foreign competition. They didn't allow imports to come in. They didn't give access to foreign exchange. They didn't allow foreign direct investment to come in. So it was very, very normal in some sense historically to have done that. But what we did in addition was, okay, we keep out the foreign guy, but the domestic industrialist also we said, sorry, you can only undertake economic activity if you get permission from me, the government. This was something that was very, very distinctive about early Indian choices. Now, why that happened, I think that's a question that we need much more historical research on. But I think this was part of, I would call this a little bit the Gandhian legacy on Indian economic policy, because Gandhiji wanted everything to be small. So there was a fear of people getting big, both for political reasons. He thought, big people, too much money, they will influence politics, but also a genuine conceptual belief that, India should be made up of small actors, economic actors, political actors. And so we had several other things which actually favored the small and acted against the big and the rich. We had something called the Monopoly and Restrictive Trade Practices Act. We had labor laws, for example, which said if you have more than 100 people or later 300 people, you had to get permission from the government if you wanted to fire people, for example. That too encouraged or discouraged, firms from becoming too big. Similarly, and then this is also, I think, fairly unique to India. We said that beginning, I think in the 70s, we said these products, and in all the sectors, they would identify products and say these can only be done by the small scale sector. It began as 10 products in the 70s. It went up to 1,000 products around the late 90s. And then, of course, it was slowly disbanded. But for a large part of India's history, we had these multiple things. If you want to become big, government's danda. This is the danda will be there because you had to get permission from government. You couldn't get big. If you got big, you paid penalties, and some of it was only allowed for the small. So I call this a kind of general equity phobia against size that we developed. Yes?
I had a question that how MITP is controlling big businesses. The MITP Act doesn't prohibit big businesses. It doesn't prohibit that business should not grow. So they are against that restrictive trade practices.
See, so the question, a very good question was, the MRTP was not against big business per se, but only if they did certain kinds of things. What you're actually saying is how, in fact, competition law works today. But at that point in time, that's not how it worked. If you were a certain size, there were many, many more, just by virtue of being big, you would have to get more permission, you couldn't do this, you couldn't do that, just by virtue of being big. So that was what all of this happened.
I doubt.
Yeah, okay. You should go and check this, yeah? Yeah?
Along with all these, whatever you say that Gandhian legacy and whatever they thought of being small, I think from first plan itself, they haven't concentrated on the human capital development. When you are basically restricting and not allowing outside, so human capital development or inside capacity building should have been there from the day one. I think even beyond this, we should have managed.
So the question is about what did we do on human capital. We'll come to that in a second. I'm going to treat that under the social choices that we made. So these are just economic choices, but it's a good question. We'll come back to that.
Would it be correct to say labor laws are just penalties? Can we encapsulate the entire gamut of labor laws as penalties?
No, I think that would. So the question is, should we view labor laws just as a form of penalties? I think that's a bit going too far, because I think some form of labor laws are also about, having to do genuine regulation of things that need to be done. But there were certain aspects of it which penalized becoming too big. And remember, all of this then were combined with incentives, tax incentives that were given more for being small and penalized you for becoming big. So it's a whole conceptually, it's a whole apparatus in the thinking, very consistent, that favored the small. So I call this the Gandhian overlay on Nehruvian, fundamentally Nehruvian economic choices. A question, but no comment. This is because I'm told people outside.
If you make this, if you don't allow, then what kind of discussion we can take?
No.
Gandhi basically was talking about village and cottage industry. I don't think anything Nehru did for the village and cottage industry. There was no promotion in the first, second and third plan about the village and cottage industry. And I think the Nehruan thinking and the Gandhian thinking was divergent. They were diagonally opposite. I'm very sorry to say, it is a you are saying that it is a Gandhian legacy because of this, all this thing happened. Nehru, in fact, did the thing what Gandhi has said.
I see two things. I am not justifying any of these choices. I'm only describing them. So please, we're not having a debate. Yeah, please. Second, remember that there are people out there who are watching who want to know what's happening rather than for your view or my view on what's happening. So let's try and keep it. No, so that's yeah. Please, you can ask questions.
We have one side track.
Yeah, we can have.
One way, you said that it would be participatory. I would say Gandhi talked about village republic, he talked about cottage industry, he talked about small scale, and he talked many things which was not in the first, second, third plan.
Okay, I've been through this, in the. I've said all this, so please. Look at everything before you comment, please. Yeah, and I'm going to be a bit harsher because there are lots of people outside wanting to hear as well. So I'm genuinely happy to take questions, speeches and bhashans. Maybe even Mr. Arun Jaitley didn't give a bhashan. If you remember that, even he. So let's try and keep to that. And here, remember, I am not justifying. I'm trying to give you a sense of what happened in Indian economic history.
You're talking about the journey here.
Yeah, journey, exactly. Yeah, good, bad, let's have over lunch. Happy to take more questions. Good, bad.
That we will talk later on what can be done. What is to be
done. Yeah, what we do towards the end. Yeah. Remember that what can be done. I'm here not as chief economic advisor. What can be done? I'm here as a professor. Okay. Okay. So this is a chart I'm going to use again and again, and I honestly think in my being chief economic advisor, if there's one conceptual diagram that I use a lot in thinking about things, it's this diagram. And I will show you this diagram over time more and more. But this is a diagram of what we call a small open economy. That is an economy that, so this is the supply curve, this is the demand curve, and this is world prices, right? So if this economy is open, this will be the domestic price, this will be demand, and this will be supply, and this will be imports. So this is a basic, simple, open economy. Now, supposing you could think about import substitution as we put a tariff on foreign imports. What will happen is that domestic prices will go up, demand will come down, supply will go up. That's why it's protecting domestic, because supply goes up from here to here. This is the impact of import substitution. And imports which were here, so much come down to here. So this is import substituting industrialization. This is something that, yeah, only for the clarificatory question.
Vertical axis, are you talking about the relative prices?
No, okay, good. So I'm sorry, I should have said this. This is quantities on the horizontal axis and prices on the vertical axis. So it could, this is the world price, but also the domestic price. If you have a tariff, you have world price plus a tariff, which gives you what the price is that domestic producers and consumers face. So that's simple way of thinking about this. Now, here's what I want to emphasize about this. So all countries around the world did this, erected tariffs in order to boost imports. That's what's called imports, and imports came down. But here's the funny thing though, that what India did with import substitution was, industrial licensing, was it said that no, I will not even allow this to happen. If you are here, even becoming big, I will impose restrictions. So it is forcing domestic production, putting restrictions on domestic production. And that is actually, I can understand if you want to penalize the foreigner, but this was a way of penalizing domestic industry. Part of it was because you didn't want people to become too big, but very few countries actually did this, because you can understand hitting out at the foreigner, but it's very difficult to understand taxing domestic industry. And that's why I call this import substitution and licensing with Indian characteristics. This is something that we did very, very special. Now, I'm running behind. Okay, so I'm going to. So let me say one last thing before. Okay, and this is where we come to guarantees versus opportunities. Social choices, and the point that was made earlier, the neglect of basic education was apparent from day one. If you look at what happened in India over time, we invested, as someone rightly pointed out, not enough in human capital. Now, we're going to do a little bit on the social sectors later on, what is happening to health, what is happening to education in India. But the basic point was that basic education remained a state subject until 1976. And there's a very lovely book by someone called Myron Weiner. It's called The Child in India, and talks about how the child was neglected because basic education was neglected. Share to primary education declined from 56% in the early 50s to 30%. So this was another aspect of, so when we talk about social, if you think that to get inclusive growth, you need to invest in human capital, but unfortunately this never happened. Now, the interesting politics of this, again, I'm not making a political statement, I'm making a description. The interesting politics was people always ask, well, why didn't the early rulers like Nehru, why didn't he emphasize basic education? To which, again, not justifying his answer was that, look, basic education was a state subject. It was not a central subject. So then the debate now is, well, formally that was true, but could he nevertheless have done more on that, using his political power and so on? So that's where the debate is. So it's a little bit like what's happening, last 2-3 years. Labor reform is both a state and a central subject. Now, the government has decided that this will do, labor reform will be left more to the states to do. So something like that happened on basic education in India. So in terms of the early choices, in terms of inclusiveness, opportunities and inclusiveness, there was a major, choice which had consequences later on in terms of, educational outcomes in India. So the final thing I would say is that also in terms of opportunities versus guarantees, I think because of all these historical issues that we had with caste especially, and the whole debate between Gandhi and Ambedkar on how to go about this, we settled finally for guarantees, as it were. For example, I don't need to go through this with you. All of you know we have reservation. It began as 22.5%. After Mandal, it's become close to 50%. Also, there are guaranteed seats in the legislatures. And now, of course, we have this in the third tier as well. So India, in some sense, chose, inclusiveness was a bit neglected because of the choices made on education. Also because, inclusiveness was to some extent affected by the fact that we didn't focus on agriculture because agriculture had most of the people. And we chose in terms of how we get inclusiveness by guaranteeing things, guaranteeing outcomes for certain communities. And so these were the broad choices that India made. So if I were to, when you are teaching this, for example, when you're teaching Indian economic history, this is one way of organizing the material. So if you were to ask me, and here I'm being a little bit more bold and saying, name the 5 or 6 big things that influenced Indian economic policy. Yeah, you have a question?
Question, a kind of comment also.
Yeah.
See, it's again, even in the human capital, whatever the education and health you are talking, I'm talking about especially for education. It is more again on the Nehruvian sides which has been there, which has got neglected, whatever it is there in the state legislation or center. Because Dr. Rajendra Prasad had a suggestion that for voting, let's have that matriculation compulsory, and in another 10 years of time, nation will become at least matriculate, and at that point of time, matriculation means whatever right now graduation is. So, had it been that incorporated, it should have been a different scenario in the health education system.
Okay. That was a comment, a question, preferably a question, please. Yeah.
I have a question that I think that the distinction between guarantee and opportunity you are saying is a little blurred.
Yeah.
I think at times it appears to be an opportunity, and at times it's guarantee also. Yeah.
That's a very good point. I think that's a very good point. You could say that this guarantee is itself a form of opportunity, right? But then the question is that is it broad-based or narrowerly focused? And and we can get into those distinctions. But I think it's a good. This is nowhere as hard and fast as this suggests. That's a very good point.
I have a comment to make.
No comments, please.
Comment in the sense that OBC stands for other backward classes.
Yeah. Very good. So please, very important corrections have to be made. We have to be very clear about this. Yeah. So please change that, my friends. So that we don't especially offend anyone. So it should be done. Now, so question, please.
Because I think it should be emphasized that these were guarantees given to political minorities.
Yeah.
So it is actually the formation of the Indian nation and three communities that we were talking about at least since the 1920s. I think the term guarantees makes sense.
Yeah. So also that I want to make a distinction between political guarantees and economic guarantees. These were economic guarantees and these were political guarantees. But you're absolutely right. It was part of redressing historical social inequities, but also furthering the formation of the political state in India. And that's a very fair point.
I thought that this could have worked as a political because there are issues saying that it is not actually implemented.
Yeah. So, absolutely, a very good point. So now, if I were to, I were asked, name, is it absolutely crucial?
Just one. Why the gender the guarantees were not taken care of? Just.
I'm not a historian, so you have to go and consult. We did do that in the 74th and 75th Constitutional Amendment, but I think you have to go and consult. So that's maybe, again, something that you could ask your students to go and explore, in terms of why that wasn't done. So if summarizing all this, I haven't come to, I keep trying to summarize. And then, of course, we had the Big Bang reforms of 1991. So far what I've been saying applied from, say, 1947 to 1991. Again, I know, I myself have done a lot of work on, anytime we draw these hard and fast distinctions, we'll say, no, some will say, actually, it happened in 85, 86, but take this as broad. We'll get into the details certainly afterwards. Big Bang reforms happened. Macroeconomic stabilization, exchange rate, we opened up the economy and we dismantled industrial licensing. And those of you who want to read a more kind of accessible narrative, which you could give to your students as reading, is Vinay Sitapathi's recent book called The Half Lion, which I think goes through, what decisions were made and how they were made. So it's a very, interesting. So if you have students who are interested in reading and politics, in addition, that would be a good way of introducing the 1991 reforms to them. Because a part of the thing I want to do here also is, to maybe recommend things that will be good for your students to read as well, and not just, talk about what is being said here. So just to, I was just thinking about it this morning or yesterday. If I were to be asked, what were the kind of 5, 6 big economic decisions that were made? And maybe you could organize your classroom teaching. If you don't like this structure, you could organize it around the 5 or 6 big events in economic history. I would certainly put the following, and again, at the risk of annoying some people, I would say 1, apart from all the things, the choices that were made by Nehru and Gandhi, Patel early on, I think certainly the second 5-year plan was a big conceptual thing. I think the industrial policy resolution, which did the commanding heights, was another one. I would think also, for example, that the industrial licensing was another big, I think, event. One of the things I haven't gone into great detail is bank nationalization in 1969. That also had a big impact on subsequent Indian economic development, and of course the 1991 Big Bang reforms. Before someone says no, this is wrong, I have another, we will discuss that over lunch. But I do think so. If you don't like this, think of other things which will come. So again, apart from what I'm saying about the economy or what you're saying about the economy, I think what I want to convey as much here is, how do you teach this? You can teach this in terms of conceptual analytical categories. You could choose, if you wanted to, say, okay, 5 or 6, depending upon how much time you wanted to spend. These would be alternative ways of doing it. Now, so what about, we come now to outcomes. What happened when all these things were done? Economic outcomes. It is 12:55 or 1:55. I think Navneeraj, my boss there, says, given that we have a whole section to do, and actually given that this is a chart that I'm going to spend 15-20. It's a chart from a famous paper that Danny Roderick and I did on the Indian growth turnaround. This is going to take about 15-20 minutes to explain. So I think that in order to both pacify you, to make you less militant, I think you should all have food and then come back on a full stomach, and then we continue the conversation. Thank you very much.